At exactly 0317 hours on May 22, 2026, in the black oil-slicked waters of the southern Strait of Hormuz, 37 nautical miles northwest of the Omani port of Qasab, the most catastrophic ambush in the history of 21st-century naval warfare was triggered by a single encrypted pulse transmitted from a hardened IRGC command bunker buried 40 meters beneath the Zagros mountain foothills. A pulse so brief it lasted only 0.003 seconds and registered on no Allied signals intelligence receiver as anything more threatening than background electromagnetic noise. Yet that invisible whisper of data immediately activated a coordinated multi-domain trap that had been seeded, rehearsed, and pre-positioned over the preceding 19 days with a level of operational patience, technical sophistication, and geopolitical cunning that would, within the next 11 minutes and 44 seconds, push the entire global energy supply chain, the fragile U.S.-Iran ceasefire architecture, and the lives of 6,800 American sailors to the absolute brink of irreversible catastrophe. And what makes this opening salvo so terrifying is not merely what it activated, but what it revealed. That Iran, with Russian electronic warfare expertise, Chinese satellite targeting data, and the accumulated tactical lessons of a 4-month war that began on the morning of February 28, 2026, when U.S. and Israeli airstrikes decapitated the Iranian government and killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, had fundamentally transformed from a legacy asymmetric threat actor into something the Pentagon's threat assessment matrix had no official doctrinal category to describe: a multi-domain, sensor-fused, AI-guided naval warfare machine operating with the tactical integration of a peer-level adversary. And by the time the USS Carl Vinson's Combat Information Center finally understood the full geometry of what was closing in from 4 simultaneous vectors, the entire carrier strike group would have fewer than 8 minutes to live. The geopolitical pressure cooker that created this moment of maximum danger had been building since the Islamabad talks collapsed on April 13, 2026, when the U.S. imposed its naval blockade of Iranian ports after Tehran refused to surrender its enriched uranium stockpile and demanded a permanent tolling system giving Iran sovereign control over all Strait of Hormuz transit, a demand that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio called flatly unacceptable on the floor of the UN Security Council, and that President Trump rejected with the kind of blunt finality that left no diplomatic face-saving room, telling reporters simply that the United States had total control of the waterway and that it would remain free, a statement that the IRGC Naval Command read not as diplomacy but as a declaration of permanent war. And over the following 5 weeks, while the world watched the ceasefire strain and break and strain again, U.S. helicopters sinking 6 Iranian fast boats on May 4th, Iranian cruise missiles targeting U.S. destroyers and being intercepted just kilometers from impact, merchant ships lying at anchor in a shipping gridlock that was costing the global economy $4.2 billion per day, the IRGC's Underwater Warfare Division, NDSA Unit 313, working in the tunneled dry dock complexes beneath Bandar Abbas, had been quietly, lethally preparing its masterstroke, a weapon system combination that had never before been operationally deployed in a contested maritime environment, a dense swarm of 32 Hoot-Advanced Autonomous Underwater Vehicles, AUVs, each one 4.7 meters long, titanium-hulled, powered by a supercavitating propulsion system derived from the original Russian Shkval torpedo design, but extensively miniaturized and AI-guided using a distributed neural network that allowed the entire swarm to share sensor data, adapt targeting priorities in real time, and operate with complete electromagnetic silence below 80 meters depth, invisible to the P-8A Poseidon's magnetic anomaly detector at that depth window, invisible to the passive sonobuoy networks that the carrier strike group had already deployed in a 40 nautical mile ring around the USS Carl Vinson, and devastatingly, invisibly patient, because NDSA Unit 313's tactical doctrine was not to attack immediately, but to loiter, to disperse, to let the current carry the swarm silently into the precise geometric formation that their pre-programmed engagement algorithm had calculated would guarantee maximum simultaneous multi-vector impact on the carrier's hull, her propulsion shafts, and the 2 escort destroyers on her flanks, before the phalanx CIWS and the ship's anti-torpedo systems could possibly generate a coherent defensive response. Simultaneously, at that same 0317 moment, 1,400 miles northwest along the Lebanese coastline, Hezbollah's Unit 4400 Shore Battery Commander, operating from a pre-surveyed firing position carved into the limestone karst bluffs 4 kilometers east of Tyre, received his own activation signal and began the pre-launch power-up sequence for 6 Chinese-supplied YJ-12 anti-ship cruise missiles, a weapon the U.S. Pacific Fleet had classified as an existential threat to surface combatants for 3 years, and which had never before been fired in anger in a Western maritime theater. Each missile a 4.5-meter Mach 2.5 supersonic Predator with a 300-kilogram shaped charge warhead and a terminal phase evasive maneuver algorithm that made it nearly impossible for SM-6 interceptors to achieve a clean kinematic firing solution inside 15 kilometers of impact. And the reason Hezbollah was firing from Lebanon at a carrier strike group operating in the Strait of Hormuz is the key to understanding the true genius and terrifying ambition of this entire operation, because those 6 YJ-12s were not intended to hit the Carl Vinson, they were intended to hit the USS Gravely and the USS Nitze, the 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers operating 14 and 22 nautical miles to the carrier's northwest in their standard CSG screening formation. The destroyers whose Spy Y-6 radar arrays and AEGIS Baseline 9 combat systems constituted the primary long-range sensor and intercept capability of the entire strike group. The destroyers whose vertical launch cells held the SM-2 and SM-6 interceptors that were the carrier's first and most lethal layer of defense against any aerial threat. And if both destroyers could be simultaneously disabled or sunk, or even simply forced into emergency defensive maneuvers that degraded their offensive intercept capacity for a 90-second window, 90 seconds, the second wave of the Iranian aerial attack, 81 Shahed 238 jet-powered kamikaze drones launched from mobile platforms scattered across 6 sites on Iran's southern coast and already airborne for 17 minutes flying at 800 meters altitude in a dense formation designed to saturate the carrier's point defense systems, would have an unobstructed kinematic corridor directly into the Carl Vinson's flight deck. And with the carrier's phalanx CIWS providing only a final 500-meter last resort barrier, the math was brutal and simple. 81 inbound contacts, 4 CIWS mounts on the Carl Vinson, each capable of engaging at most 2 targets per second in a degraded multi-target environment. The numbers did not work in America's favor. And Iran's operations planners at NDSA Unit 313 had run this exact engagement simulation 847 times over the previous 3 weeks and achieved a carrier hit probability of 73%, a number that the IRGC's Supreme Commander had judged sufficient to authorize the operation's execution. But none of this, not the AUV swarm at depth, not the Hezbollah shore batteries, not the Shahed wave already crossing Iranian airspace, would have been possible without the third prong of the attack that had been engineered not in Tehran, but in St. Petersburg, in the electronic warfare skunk works of the Russian GRU Directorate, specifically by the team responsible for developing what Western intelligence agencies had designated Frosthammer, a next-generation offensive electronic warfare capability that had been delivered to IRGC Cyber Command in a dead-drop data transfer at the Iranian embassy in Baku 6 weeks ago, a capability that its Russian architects had described in their own classified documentation as a tailored logical weapon designed to inject cascading false target data into the Link 16 tactical data network at the specific authentication layer used by AEGIS Baseline 9 combat systems, exploiting a zero-day vulnerability in the Tattle-J protocol stack that the NSA actually identified and flagged in a February 2025 classified advisory, but which the Navy's software patching cycle had not yet propagated to all platforms, meaning that the USS Gravely, the USS Nitze, and the USS Carl Vinson were all, at this moment, running AEGIS software that contained a known exploitable flaw. and at 03:17:22 hours, precisely 5 seconds after the initial IRGC activation pulse, Frosthammer went live, and in the combat information centers of all 3 ships simultaneously, the Spy Y-6 radar screens began to bloom with phantom contacts, not the crude ghost tracks of old-generation barrage jamming, but surgically precise false targets injected directly into the radar's own track file management system, each phantom moving at exactly the aerodynamic profile of a Shahed 238 kamikaze drone, each one with a believable flight path origin point, each one demanding immediate engagement priority from the AEGIS fire control computers, and within 4.3 seconds, the AEGIS system on the USS Gravely had already generated 64 separate SM-2 launch authorizations against 64 contacts that did not exist, locking the fire control computer in a processing loop that consumed 89% of its available computational bandwidth, effectively paralyzed in a digital fog of false certainties, unable to distinguish the 64 phantom tracks from the 81 real Shaheds that were at this moment crossing the Iranian coast and entering international airspace at 800 meters altitude, 180 kilometers northwest and closing fast. The combat information officer on the USS Gravely, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Okafor, a 9-year Aegis warfare specialist who had survived the May 4th incident 10 days earlier when an Iranian cruise missile detonated 200 meters off the Gravely's port bow, looked at her display at 03:17:29 and felt something that years of training had conditioned her to recognize and report immediately. The tactical picture was too clean, too symmetrical, the contact spacing too geometrically regular for a real-world drone swarm, which always exhibited irregular inter-vehicle spacing due to launch timing variance and wind shear. And she did not wait for doctrine. She did not call the TAO. She reached directly across her console and entered the emergency AEGIS override code that forced the combat system into a manual track approval mode, a decision that would, in retrospect, be credited with saving the carrier strike group, but which at that specific moment represented the kind of split-second unilateral judgment call that naval warfare doctrine explicitly prohibits precisely because it bypasses the automated response speed that peer-level threats demand. And the reason it worked is that simultaneously, 14 miles away aboard the USS Carl Vinson, the carrier's E-2D Hawkeye early warning aircraft already airborne on the standard CSG Combat Air Patrol at 25,000 feet altitude, call sign Guardian 61, detected the radar anomaly not through its own sensors, but through the sudden disappearance of the Gravely's contact track updates from the Link 16 network feed. A 4-second gap in data transmission that Guardian 61's senior battle controller, Commander James Whitfield, recognized immediately as a network disruption signature consistent with the Frosthammer threat advisory that Fifth Fleet had distributed 6 days earlier, but that most CIC watchstanders had filed under low-probability theoretical threats. And Whitfield immediately switched his E-2D's own ANPY-9 radar to full-power active mode, illuminating the entire northern approach corridor with 10-megawatt search pulses, and within 2 sweeps, his own radar processor began resolving the actual threat picture. 81 real contacts bearing 342 degrees, range 161 kilometers and closing at 220 meters per second. No IFS response, flight profile consistent with Shahed 238 jet-powered UCAVs, time to carrier range 12 minutes 18 seconds. And at the same instant, Whitfield's FIR system caught something that chilled the compartment to silence. 6 additional high-speed contacts, Mach 2.4, bearing 291 degrees, range 78 kilometers, origin point consistent with Lebanese coastal coordinates, flight profile consistent with YJ-12 anti-ship cruise missiles, time to USS Gravely, 97 seconds. 97 seconds. Whitfield transmitted the contact data on the emergency voice circuit at 03:17:51, 29 seconds after the Frosthammer injection began, and in those 29 seconds, the USS Gravely's AEGIS system had already generated and transmitted 16 SM-2 launch authorizations against phantom targets. none of which had been executed yet because of LTCDR Okafor's override, and now Whitfield's data package, transmitted simultaneously to the Carl Vinson's own SPY-6 array, which was now being cross-referenced against the E-2D's independent track picture, gave the carrier's AEGIS system exactly the external truth reference it needed to recognize that its own track files had been corrupted. The AEGIS combat management system on the Carl Vinson ran its own internal data fusion algorithm comparing the Link 16 feed against the direct SPY-6 radar returns against the E-2D's transmitted track data and flagged a 94% confidence correlation between the Frosthammer advisory pattern and its current sensor anomaly. And at 031758, the Carl Vinson's AEGIS system autonomously executed a combat system hard restart, a 22-second reboot cycle, during which the carrier would be running blind, no AEGIS, no integrated fire control, 22 seconds of absolute vulnerability. And the IRGC had known about this restart vulnerability, had counted on triggering it, had timed the entire attack architecture around the assumption that the AEGIS hard restart would happen between 031800 and 031830, which was precisely the window they needed because at 031804, the 6 Hezbollah YJ-12 missiles crossed the radar horizon of the USS Nitze, 47 kilometers northwest, and the Nitze's SPY-6 had not been infected by Frosthammer because the Nitze had received the February 2025 NSA patch during her last maintenance cycle at Manama. She was the one ship in the formation running clean softclear, and the Nitze's TAO, Commander Marcus Chen, already had a perfect track solution on all 6 inbound YJ-12s and immediately executed a 6-round SM-6 salvo from his forward VLS cells, the missiles roaring off the deck in a 6-second ripple fire sequence that sent columns of white smoke streaking northwest across the black water, each SM-6 and $4.1 million kinetic solution flying at Mach 3.5 in the terminal phase. And Chen simultaneously activated the Nitze's Noka active decoy rounds, air-launched expendables that broadcast a radar signature 40 times larger than the destroyer itself, designed to suck the YJ-12's active radar seekers away from the ship's hull. And 4 of the 6 SM-6s found their targets, 4 brilliant orange fireballs erupting at altitudes between 800 and 2,400 meters northwest of the formation at 031819. And the remaining 2 YJ-12s, seeker heads confused by the Nulka decoy bursts, broke lock and began hunting for a new target. And one of them, call it Missile 5, reacquired the Nitze at 031831 from a range of only 4.1 kilometers and went supersonic into its terminal dive, and Chen's CIWS opened fire, the block of 20mm tungsten rounds thundering out at 4,500 rounds per minute, a wall of fire that connected with Missile 5 at 800 meters range and shredded its airframe, but did not fully detonate its shaped charge warhead, meaning the debris field, 40 kilograms of high-velocity titanium and steel fragments traveling at 600 meters per second, impacted the Nitze's forward superstructure, wrecking the SPQ-9B Horizon Search radar antenna and killing 3 sailors on the bridge wing, a wound serious enough to degrade the Nitze's engagement capacity but not to remove her from the fight. And as this entire kinetic exchange resolved in the northwest quadrant of the formation, the second and far more lethal threat was developing 140 kilometers north-northeast, where the 81 Shahed 238s had now reorganized from their transit formation into their final attack dispersal pattern, spreading laterally across a 35-kilometer front in groups of 5 and 6, each group on a slightly different bearing to the carrier, designed to ensure that no single SM-6 intercept geometry could achieve simultaneous kills on more than 2 drones, a saturation architecture that the IRGC had clearly reverse-engineered from captured Israeli Heron doctrine and refined with Russian operational analysis from the Ukrainian theater's lessons in drone swarm warfare. And the Carl Vinson's AEGIS, now 18 seconds into its hard restart cycle with 4 seconds remaining before combat system restoration, could not yet respond, and in those 4 seconds, the strike group's air defense posture rested entirely on 2 assets, the 4 FA-18F Super Hornets of VFA-211 already on the cap, call signs Striker 11 through 14, who had been vectored northwest by Guardian 61 and were now screaming toward the incoming swarm
swarm at Mach 1.3 in full afterburner, each aircraft armed with 6 AIM-120D AMRAAMs and 2 AIM-9X Sidewinders. And Commander Alexandro Reyes in Striker 11, a combat veteran of the February 28th strike package that opened the Iran war, immediately recognized the scale of what his AESA radar display was painting on his helmet display. 81 targets spread across a 35-kilometer front, all heading for the carrier. And without waiting for weapons release authorization, he transmitted a single word to his flight: commit. 4 Super Hornets against 81 kamikaze drones in a 12-minute engagement window. The mathematics of that equation should have been a death sentence for the carrier, but Reyes had flown 3 combat cruises and understood one thing about drone swarm engagements that the IRGC's simulator runs had apparently not modeled correctly. Swarms require coordination frequency. They require a communication architecture to maintain their formation logic. And if you can find and destroy the swarm's coordination node, the lead drone broadcasting the formation management signal, the geometric dispersion collapses. The trailing drones begin to default to their last programmed heading. The beautiful lethality of the coordinated swarm degrades into a confused mob of individual drones, each flying a fixed track without adaptive retargeting. And Reyes, using the APG-79 AESA radar in its high-resolution mapping mode, spent 7.3 seconds scanning the swarm's radio emissions and identified a single Shahed 238 flying at a slightly higher altitude than the others, 40 meters higher, and transmitting a 2.4 GHz formation control signal. The coordinator, drone designation Alpha 1, and Reyes fired a single AIM-120D from a range of 31 kilometers and watched the AMRAAM go supersonic and Alpha 1 vanish from his display in a flash of fragmentation debris. And the effect on the swarm was immediately visible on his radar. The precise 35-kilometer front formation began to lose geometric coherence within 4 seconds, individual drones drifting laterally, some switching to their pre-programmed fixed bearing mode and continuing toward the carrier, but now as individual targets rather than coordinated killers. And at 03:18:59, the Carl Vinson's AEGIS system completed its hard restart and came back online to a threat picture that had transformed from an elegant multi-vector kill box into a degraded but still lethal scattergun of 79 remaining drones. 2 had collided in the formation confusion, converging on the carrier from a still wide 22-kilometer front. And the AEGIS immediately began generating intercept solutions, firing SM-2 Block 3B missiles from the Carl Vinson's own VLS cells at a rate of 1 every 2.8 seconds. The sky to the north of the carrier erupting into a cascade of white trails and orange detonations as the SM-2s found their targets in the middle layers of the drone wave. And Striker 11 through 14 expended their AMRAAM loadouts in furious 2-second ripple-fire sequences, scoring 28 kills in 94 seconds of continuous engagement. And the NITSI, despite her damaged forward radar, contributed her own SM-2 solutions on the eastern flank of the drone wave. And the CIWS mounts on the Carl Vinson, all 4 of them tracking and firing, began their grinding attrition work against the drones that slipped through the missile intercepts. 20mm tungsten range shredding airframes at 800 meters range. And through this entire maelstrom of kinetic fire, 14 Shahed 238s penetrated to within 3 kilometers of the carrier hull. 14, and of those 14, 11 were destroyed by the CIWS wall between 800 and 180 meters range, and 2 were shredded by a pair of rolling airframe rounds from the carrier's CRAM mount at 600 meters range, and 1, a single Shahed 238, callsign Zulfikar 47, absorbed a CIWS burst that destroyed its guidance section but did not stop its forward momentum. And the dead airframe, 185 kilograms of aluminum and explosive traveling at 340 meters per second, impacted
the Carl Vinson's island structure at the level of the primary communications mast array at 03:20:18. The explosion, small by naval combat standards, a 25-kilogram warhead, but precisely devastating in its effect, destroying the ship's primary HF and SATCOM antenna clusters, severing the carrier's secure communications communications link to 5th Fleet in Bahrain and to CENTCOM Forward Headquarters, a communications blackout that the carrier's crew did not yet know was about to become the most strategically dangerous consequence of the entire attack. More dangerous than the island damage, more dangerous than the 11 sailors wounded in the impact, more dangerous than anything that had happened in the air. Because 80 meters beneath the hull of the USS Carl Vinson, at a depth of 96 meters in the thermocline boundary layer, where acoustic propagation was brutally distorted and the P-8A Poseidon's passive sonobuoy network had a systematic blind spot caused by the thermocline's sound refraction effects, the 32 Hoot-Advanced Autonomous Underwater Vehicles of NDSA Unit 313 were completing their final approach. 32 supercavitating underwater drones that had been lying dormant in their pre-positioned dispersal zone 4 kilometers southeast of the carrier's last known position for 9 hours. Launched from a converted IRGC submarine tender operating under the cover of legitimate fishing vessel AIS signatures 3 days ago, and at 03:17:00, 17 minutes before the aerial attack began, those 32 AUVs had received their activation pulse and begun their silent, coordinated approach at 42 knots, moving through the thermocline boundary layer in a precise geometrical formation that their onboard AI continuously adjusted to maintain acoustic silence relative to the carrier's own hull sonar sensors, and by 03:20:30, 12 seconds after Zulfikar 47 hit the island, the AUV swarm had closed to 280 meters from the Carl Vinson's keel, at which point their terminal phase algorithm activated their supercavitating propulsion at full power, the Schwal-derived drive system that created a bubble of superheated water around the AUV's nose, reducing hydrodynamic drag to near zero and accelerating each vehicle from 42 knots to 196 knots in 1.4 seconds, and the sound of 32 simultaneously activating supercavitating drives erupted through the water around the carrier like a wall of thunder, instantly detectable by every sonar system in the strike group, but at 196 knots, 280 meters away, the time to impact was less than 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, the Carl Vinson's SQQ-89A V-15 sonar system screamed a submarine contact alarm. The ship's AT-6 decoy launch system fired 2 acoustic countermeasures that created a wall of bubbles and noise across the AUV approach vector, and the destroyers on either flank launched LAMP's helicopter-delivered lightweight torpedoes in emergency intercept mode. But at 196 knots in supercavitation, the AUVs were already inside the minimum safe intercept geometry for the Mk-54 lightweight torpedoes, which required a minimum 300-meter arming distance. And 16 of the 32 AUVs impacted the Carl Vinson's hull and the 2 forward destroyer screens in the next 4.7 seconds, not in a random spread, but in the precise geometric pattern that NDSA Unit 313's algorithm had calculated months ago. 6 impacts concentrated on the Carl Vinson's port propulsion shaft sponson at frame 47, designed to jam both port propeller shafts simultaneously and stop the carrier dead in the water. 4 impacts on the keel amidships, targeting structural ribs 14, 15, 16, and 17 in a pattern calculated to induce a controlled hogging deformation that would warp the flight deck beyond safe operations. And the remaining 6 impacts spread between the 2 escort destroyers in a pattern targeting each ship's sonar dome and rudder assembly. And the blasts, while each one individually was a shaped charge weapon designed to penetrate steel plating rather than to create explosive overpressure catastrophe, collectively hit the Carl Vinson with a kinetic and structural trauma that no simulation had ever fully modeled. 16 simultaneous impact events across a 280-meter hull, each one a precisely directed jet of superplastic steel cutting through 50-millimeter plate at 9,000 meters per second. And the Carl Vinson immediately lost all port propulsion, began a slow 6-degree list to port, and the flight deck structural sensors registered the hogging deformation at 0.34 degrees, below the 0.8-degree threshold for mandatory flight operation suspension, but just barely. And damage Control parties flooded the affected frames within 90 seconds, and the list began to stabilize at 4.2 degrees. And the carrier was alive. The carrier was hurt, but alive. Her nuclear reactors intact behind their layered protective bulkheads, her starboard propulsion shafts still turning at reduced power, her crew responding with the brutal professional competence that the U.S. Navy had spent 2 decades drilling into every man and woman aboard. And across the strike group, the battle damage assessment was devastating but not terminal. The USS Gravely's AEGIS fully restored after the frost hammer infection was purged using the NSA-supplied emergency decontamination protocol. The USS Nitsy operational with degraded forward radar, 3 dead and 14 wounded. The Carl Vinson with 11 wounded from the island impact, conducting emergency damage control on 16 AUV penetration sites, listing 4 degrees to port, unable to conduct flight operations for the next 40 minutes while the deck structural inspection was completed. 40 minutes of zero carrier-based air power projection in the most tactically critical sea lane on Earth. And it was in that 40-minute window that the fourth and final prong of Iran's operation activated, the one the IRGC had coded Operation Dark Tide, and which had been running silently in the background since before the first AUV activated, because an IRGC Ghadir-class midget submarine, designation UNES-7, had been pre-positioned 3 weeks earlier in a deep acoustic shadow zone beneath an Iranian-flagged dhow 22 nautical miles northeast of the carrier strike group. And UNES-7 was not carrying torpedoes. She was carrying something far more strategically dangerous. A 2-man IRGC Special Naval Forces team equipped with portable SATCOM terminals and a data package containing the real-time GPS coordinates of the crippled Carl Vinson, the engagement statistics from the past 18 minutes of battle, and a 180-second video compilation of the carrier's list and the AUV impact damage photographed by a pre-positioned underwater drone camera. Content Iran intended to broadcast simultaneously on Press TV, Telegram, and through a direct data feed to Russian, Chinese, and Tatari state media the moment UNES-7's antenna broke the surface. A strategic information warfare detonation designed to announce to every oil market, every shipping company, every allied and adversary nation watching the Hormuz crisis that the United States Navy had been seriously damaged in the world's most critical sea lane, that the U.S. blockade was broken, that Iran's deterrence capability was validated, and that any nation currently considering whether to respect the U.S. naval blockade and deny Iran oil export revenue now had concrete evidence that American naval supremacy in the Persian Gulf had been fundamentally challenged. An information strike potentially worth more than all 16 AUV impacts combined, because the oil markets were already at $103 per barrel, and a single credible video of a listing U.S. carrier in the Strait would send futures past $140 before Wall Street opened, would collapse insurance underwriting for every vessel in the region, would give the Kremlin the propaganda coup it needed to rally international pressure for an end to the blockade, and would tell Beijing that the moment to test the Taiwan Strait was closer than anyone in Washington had calculated. UNES-7 began its ascent at 032400. The Virginia-class fast-attack submarine USS New Hampshire SSN 778, which had been operating in passive sonar track mode 8.4 nautical miles northeast of the carrier strike group for the past 6 days, her presence known to Fifth Fleet, unknown to the IRGC, detected the Ghadir's pump jet activation on her TB-33 fin-line towed array at 032352, 8 seconds before the midget submarine began to move. And the New Hampshire's commanding officer, Commander Patricia Walsh, immediately understood what she was looking at. A Ghadir-class contact, extremely shallow at 34 meters, moving toward the surface. And the tactical logic of the moment clicked with absolute clarity. This submarine was not positioning for a weapon shot. It was ascending to broadcast, and whatever it was about to broadcast would be detonating the strategic information landscape across the entire conflict. And Walsh made a decision in the next 11 seconds that no submarine warfare doctrine document explicitly authorized, but that every fiber of her tactical judgment demanded. She fired a single Mark 48 80-cap torpedo on a deliberately non-lethal intercept track, not aimed at UNES-7's hull, but programmed to detonate 30 meters ahead of the midget submarine's bow, a warning shot in the deepest and most unambiguous language of underwater warfare. And the detonation at 032409 created a pressure wave that slammed into UNES-7 at 340 kilopascals, enough to rupture her external antenna masts, crack her optical periscope seal, and force an immediate emergency ballast dump, sending her plunging back to 60 meters depth in a terrified and damaged crash dive. The SATCOM broadcast attempt aborted. The strategic information weapon misfired. The video that would have broken the oil market never transmitted. And in the silence that followed, the only sound was Walsh's sonar operator quietly reporting, "USS-7 is descending, sir. Bearing 047. She's running east, fast." The battle was over. In 17 minutes and 41 seconds, the most sophisticated multi-domain naval ambush in the history of modern warfare had been conceived, executed, and ultimately defeated not by superior firepower alone, but by a cascade of individual decisions made in the fog of battle by officers and enlisted specialists who had been trained over years and deployments and countless degraded operations exercises to think faster than the enemy's automation, to trust anomalies, to override doctrine when doctrine became a liability, to remain lethal even when blinded. And what the world did not know yet, sitting in the pre-dawn silence of May 22, 2026, with the Carl Vinson listing 4 degrees to port in the dark waters of the Strait of Hormuz, and the oil tanker convoy she had been escorting still sitting at anchor 40 miles east, waiting for a corridor that might never open, was that this battle was a statement. The IRGC had proven it could design an attack complex enough to hurt a nuclear supercarrier in the world's most contested waterway, had proven it could integrate Russian cyber capabilities, Chinese satellite data, Lebanese proxy fire, and domestic underwater drone technology into a single synchronized strike package that overwhelmed multiple defense layers simultaneously, had proven that the era of unchallenged U.S. naval dominance in the Persian Gulf was gone, replaced by something more ambiguous and more dangerous, a balance of terror where every escort mission and every convoy protection operation would now carry the mathematical possibility of catastrophic loss. And even as damage control teams on the Carl Vinson sealed the last of the AUV penetration sites and the carrier's medical staff triaged the wounded from the island strike, and Commander Walsh brought the New Hampshire to periscope depth to restore the carrier strike group's communication link using her own SATCOM antenna, the harder truth was already assembling itself in the intelligence assessments being typed in Bahrain, Langley, and the Pentagon's E-ring. The IRGC had 32 Hoot-Advanced AUVs before this engagement, had expended 16 today in the attack package, and lost 4 more to torpedo intercepts, leaving them with approximately 12 in operational reserve. And the production facility at Bandar Abbas had a 30-day replenishment cycle. And the global shipping gridlock sitting at anchor outside the Strait of Hormuz was costing $4.2 billion per day in frozen commerce. And the ceasefire talks in Muscat were at this moment paused, with the U.S. delegation unable to contact Washington because the Carl Vinson's communications were down, and the back-channel link through the Oman Foreign Ministry had gone dead in the chaos of the battle. And the oil market futures would open in Tokyo in 4 hours, and every analyst covering the Persian Gulf would be staring at satellite imagery of a listing U.S. carrier in the Strait of Hormuz and drawing their own conclusions. And somewhere beneath 40 meters of black water in the Gulf of Oman, USS-7 was turning for home with a cracked periscope seal and a broken antenna mast, but her crew alive and her data package still intact on her embedded storage drives, waiting for a moment when she might surface undetected. And the captain of USS-7 knew something Commander Walsh could not know from her sonar track. The video was not on the antenna transmission system. It had already been uploaded to a satellite relay queue before the New Hampshire's warning shot. It had been sitting in a dead-drop server queue for 4 minutes 31 seconds, waiting for a coded release authorization that the IRGC broadcast operations team in their Bandar Abbas facility would transmit the moment they confirmed USS-7's survival. And the authorization signal was 0.003 seconds long, and it would register on no Allied signal intelligence receiver as anything more threatening than background electromagnetic noise, the same whisper of data that started all of this. And the USS New Hampshire, her sonar ears sweeping the dark water around her, had no idea that the strategic information bomb had not been disarmed, only delayed. And the Strait of Hormuz, costing the world $4.2 billion in frozen commerce, listing 1 U.S. supercarrier, 3 dead American sailors, and the last intact fragment of a ceasefire architecture that 17 nations had spent 6 weeks trying to hold together, was about to get a great deal more dangerous before the sun rose over the Zagros Mountains. The oceans are no longer safe. The boundaries of this war have dissolved into the electromagnetic spectrum, into the thermocline, into the satellite relay queues of nations that never declared war on anyone, And next time, because there will be a next time, the operational data from this engagement is already in a GRU briefing room in St. Petersburg and a PALN Navy Analysis Center in Sanya. Next time, there will be no warning shot, no lieutenant commander who breaks doctrine at the right moment, no Virginia-class submarine that happened to be in the exact right acoustic position. What happens then? What does the world look like the morning that question gets answered? Tell us what you think below, and if you believe American naval power will hold the line in the months ahead, comment 1. If you think the balance has already shifted beyond recovery, comment 0. The board is set, the sensors are hot, and somewhere in the dark water of the Strait of Hormuz, 37 nautical miles northwest of Kasab, the USS Carl Vinson is still listing 4 degrees to port, alive, hurt, and waiting for the dawn.